The number one resource in this province in the next century is going to be clean water. Why the hell should we let them destroy a sustainable resource in the name of 12 years worth of jobs? Because that's how long empty stayed. The only reason that I did the work that I have done in the last 33 years on Equity Silver Mine was that I care about this place. And there's a quote by Frank Herbert in Dune. It's a Bene Gesserit proverb. Humans live best when each has their own place to stand, when each knows where they belong in the scheme of things and what they may achieve. Destroy the place, and you destroy the person. A lot of people don't get that nowadays because they don't live in place. They're not connected to the land. But the people that live in place, that live in the natural world, are directly connected to it, they get that. They understand that. And that's when they're willing to fight. That's when they're willing to stand up and do something because of the place. I didn't do what I've done for my neighbors or for the town or for anything else, but this place in the world that I love.
I first heard about Glenda through my sister, who is a teacher up north that does environmental sorts of things. And she said to me, you got to meet this woman. You just got to meet her. She single-handedly took on equity mines, and it cost them around $1 million when she was finished. I don't know if that's true.
32, actually.
$32 million. So that's pretty.
I'll get to that.
Pretty powerful woman. And I'm also really glad that she came. It feels like somebody from home has come down here. I really appreciate it. Glenda won the 1986 BC Ministries Award for Environmental Achievement and the Citizens Award, and she, at that time, was the only woman, the only northerner to have won that award. I don't know if you're still alive.
I don't know.
And she was nominated again last year. She's on several committees of various forestry, mining, and local resource planning committees. She gave me a long list of all of them, and which I won't read out, but if you want to know, I'm sure she'll tell you about that. And so without further ado, I'll turn this over to Glenda.
Okay. Just a little background. Background's the hardest part for me because it's personal. But I was born in San Diego, and so was my husband. We were born in the same hospital. We met each other in high school. We married, we had 2 sons, and then when we were in our mid-20s, we decided we no longer wanted to live in the city. So we immigrated to British Columbia and just kept going north until we found a place that we wanted to be, and it wound up to be the Buck Flats Road, 1972. And we built a log house, and we congratulated ourselves on a weekly basis that we had really figured out how to hide away from the troubles of the world and get on with all of the tiny little minute things that were terribly important to us and ignore all the very big things that were going on around us. And that worked really well until 1981. But when we were in California, we were activists. We were environmental and civil rights activists and anti-war activists. And I think that was one of the things that sort of impelled our immigration, our travel north, was the dissatisfaction with the U.S. government and the fact that they were spending more on weapon systems than social programs, and that made Canada very attractive to us. But we learned how to do things because we fought the city of San Diego, we fought the Army Corps of Engineers, and we did a lot of things. And if you want to win, you have to get into the detail work. So we hid out on the Buck Flats Road, and the years went by. And in 1981, in November, I was in my kitchen, and CBC radio came on at noon, and it said that Equity Silver Mines had had an acid spill. and for anyone on the Buck Creek not to drink the water. Well, we weren't directly on Buck Creek, but our well is situated right next to Buck Creek. So I figured that I had a little leeway time. I filled everything in the house that I could with water and then waited because they said a waste management branch person would come to my home. And about 5 o'clock that night, this very tall, very thin man named Terry Roberts came to my door with some plastic bottles, went down to Buck Creek, took some water samples, told me that they had spilled 10,000 gallons of concentrated sulphuric acid into their mill yard, but that he thought that they would be able to clean it up, and this was just a secondary check to make sure that none of it had escaped into the environment. That was on a Thursday. On Friday, they came back and tested my water again. But on Friday, they then said to me they thought maybe some of the sulfuric acid had escaped the mill yard. Well, on Saturday, the mining people came to my door to assure me that the spill had been entirely cleaned up. And to give you an idea what 10,000 gallons is, it's a tank that's twice as tall as this room and about as wide in a big circle, a big silo of concentrated sulfuric acid. And what concentrated sulfuric acid does is when it mixes with water, it becomes more corrosive. So that as you diluted it, say with a fire hose or something, you would actually have a bigger environmental problem than if you left it as a gel. On Saturday, when the mine people came to my door, they sat in my living room and they told me they'd cleaned up the entire spill. And by the time they left, they'd convinced my husband and I that we were in big trouble. Because we never had anybody come to our door like that, not even in San Diego, when bad things were happening. So on Sunday we drove up the road with some neighbors and went to Bessemer Creek, which was the back drainage of Equity, and Bessemer Creek looked like orange paint. And they hadn't contained any of the spill. What they had done when they spilled the acid, they had a gravel yard, but the gravel is 15 feet deep and all the pipes for all of their buildings, their leach plant and everything was under there. So when the acid spilled, they just hosed the acid down into this gravel system because if they didn't, the acid was going to eat all their pipes apart. And the drainage of this gravel yard was a perimeter drain system that fed directly through 6 culverts into Bessemer Creek. And Bessemer Creek fed directly down into my watershed. So not only had they not contained any of the spill, but they'd actually caused a bigger problem by washing it down with fire hoses and then proceeded to lie about it. Anyway, we took a bunch of pictures of Bessemer Creek, and Bessemer Creek was killed all the way, 5 kilometers, all the way down till the dilution of Upper Buck Creek, and then it disappeared. It was November 18th, disappeared under the snow. So Sunday night I called CBC Radio, Cam Ford and Prince Rupert, when we had regional radio people that we could deal with, news people, which we really don't anymore. And I told him what I'd done and what had happened, and I went on the radio Monday morning. And in the meantime, they also got a mines person, a mines inspector, to go on the radio who continued to insist they'd cleaned it all up. So then I realized not only was I going to have to fight the company, I was also going to be fighting the government because they were willing to lie in public about what had happened. They were willing to misrepresent the facts. My son says it's rude to lie, to say liar or lion. So Hap and I, Tuesday, we sat down and we said, no, we either just be really quiet and we sell the place and we move, or we stay and we spend a lot of money fighting this. And we couldn't think of any place else to go, so we stayed. And Wednesday I went to the waste management branch and went in to see this man, Terry Roberts. He had a staff of 3 people. And I asked for the equity file and they couldn't find it. In the meantime, on December 10th, it's a real short periods of time here. On December 10th, the mine had a private meeting with all of the people that lived on the Buck Flats Road. And you could only get in the door. There were no media people allowed. You could only get in the door with a written invitation they sent us in the mail. And I thought, well, this is a good sign because now they'll tell us the truth, and now we'll get on with the business at hand. But they proceeded during this meeting to again tell us they had cleaned up the entire acid spill, even though by this time we had heavy metals readings of thousands of parts per million of iron and aluminum and zinc, a lot of it from their culvert system, which had been completely dissolved by the acid, coming down into my watershed. So we got up. We had some other displaced Yanks on the road with master's degrees in chemical engineering and hydrology. We got up and we laid it to them for an hour and a half. And they agreed to have another meeting with us at the end of February. But what they did do at that meeting, the mine manager had a book, a green book, and he kept looking in it for old heavy metals readings. And after the meeting, I said, can I borrow that book? And he said, no, you can't. It's the company records. But the same records are photocopied and sent to the waste management branch. So middle of December, just before Christmas, I was back in Smithers going through a cardboard box in which all of these photocopies had been thrown for the last year and a half. And Cindy Stoltenberg and I categorized them, and we also found in there a phone number for the Environmental Protection Service, which is the federal government, and it's now called Environment Canada. And we called up the office, and Fred Claggett called us back and said that he would try to help us. He said that he'd send us the baseline impact studies from when this mine was originally proposed in the 70s. We got those in the mail about the same time that we got all the monitoring information in line. And we realized that 6 months before the acid spill, there were acidic readings at 2 different locations on the site that were a higher elevation and a different siting watershed entirely from where the acid spill had occurred, but we didn't understand what they were. But at that same time, we got the EPS studies from 1973 and 74, and it said the hazard of acid mine drainage would be a problem and it would have to be addressed when the mine plan was designed. Well, I looked up acid mine drainage in the encyclopedia and found out that this is what happens in sulfide deposits. And it's been known for centuries to happen. I wrote it all out really big on sheets of paper to take into Terry Roberts, who I thought was an office manager. I didn't realize he was also a chemical engineer. I explained to him what acid mine drainage was, and I said I thought that Equity had acid mine drainage. They'd known about it, and they hadn't told the government, but in the meantime, because of the monitoring from the acid spill, Terry Roberts' office, the regional office, had found out about it, but they didn't want anyone to know. Well, we prepared a huge question fact sheet, and we got everybody on the Buck Flats to go to the public meeting, but we also got Kate Matheson from CFTK Television and CBC Radio, and we got them there for our public meeting in February, and we basically let the company, we didn't tell them ahead of time that we knew. They thought they were going to talk about the acid spill and how they cleaned it up. We let them give their presentation, and then we went to the acid mine drainage problem. They said it was a localized, small problem, and it wasn't. It wasn't localized at all. When they had gone into the sulfide deposit, and if we can talk about that later, I'll get to it, but it's a type of mineral deposit where you have sulfides in the mineralization itself, but you actually have more of them in the waste product, the stuff that they don't want. When they break up an open pit mine, if one truck goes to the mill, usually 3 or 4 trucks go to a rock dump. And when you're stripping a mine and you have a lot of waste material, it's very tempting for a company to use that material to build all their roads, the ballast for all their roads, all their tailings dams, the gravel in the mill yard, all those the rest of those things. And when this acid is exposed to atmosphere after it's broken up, it oxidizes, and then when rainwater hits it, it creates sulfuric acid. And as the sulfuric acid goes through the rock, dissolves all the heavy metals into a solution called acid mine drainage. And then you have highly toxic, metals contaminated, liquid effluent escaping the site from hundreds, thousands of locations. So they denied that it was a widespread problem, even though they'd known. They built all their roads and dams and everything out of it. And they also had covered up the fact that they had low pH, pH 3 water in May before the acid spill had ever occurred in November. So then I got to the point where not only, I thought I could still fix this. I didn't know that I couldn't fix it yet, and that was good because I wasn't confronted right away with the fact that this was an insurmountable, insolvable problem. I kept thinking, well, if I just raise hell with them for a little bit longer, just get on the radio, just do a few things. Placer Dome was the major shareholder. They'll get too embarrassed to have this going on, and they'll pay to fix whatever the problem is. So that's what I did for the next 6 months at huge expense and personal expense, because of course everyone in town by that time thought I was trying to shut the mine down. And this mine employed over 300 people. So I was in a sort of difficult position, but we're not very social, rather private people, so it didn't really matter to me that a lot of people were mad at me. I didn't have to pay any physical price. Like, I wasn't like Colleen McQuarrie. Nobody was coming out to my house to spit on it because I was too far out of town. So time went on, time passed, and everything that I learned. I went into waste management once a week, during this time, and basically Terry Roberts got to the point when he saw me coming, he'd go into the men's room. So I'd have to wait. But I waited until he came back out. I'd usually go upstairs to Fish and Wildlife and I studied heavy metals contamination and body burdens and liquid mine effluent discharges, and learned what a tailings pond was, what the mill did, what the waste dump was. I thought that the waste dump was actually where they put their garbage, but in fact the waste dump is where they put their waste rock. So after a year of harassment, Terry decided to implement a public surveillance committee where I could sit across the table from the company and I would ask them questions and they would answer them. And he would be the chair, so he would be sort of removed from the confrontation, but then there would be information shared. And DFO and the Federal Environment Canada people, everyone could be at the table to share information. And that was a difficult situation for me because the mine continued to give me misinformation. And what I did as a technique was I had a series of questions, 3 questions, and I'd ask the first 2, which I already knew the answer to. Like, what were the copper readings in Bessemer Creek during March? Because spring is when we have our worst runoffs. And if they lied to me during that, then I would say, no, you're wrong, it was 3.43 parts per million. And then I'd ask the second question, and again, I would already know the answer, and then if they lied to me. So then the third question I didn't know the answer to. By now, they're so browbeaten that they tell me the truth about the third question. And that worked reasonably well, and I had to do that for 4 years. But then after that, I lost those upper management people because they couldn't deal with me anymore. And I got the environmental coordinator, who was Bob Patterson. And he was the pit foreman. He was just handed the job of environmental coordinator at Equity and rose to the occasion, and he told the truth. And sometimes it was painful for him to tell the truth, but after that, there was a lot of information sharing, and there was a lot of really positive public dynamic, but it was all closed. There was no avenue to let even the people in town know what we were doing. Nobody attended our meetings. There was no press releases, so most of what we did was done in secret, but it was actually most of it done also by consensus. But of course the company economics drove the process. We couldn't ask them to do something that they couldn't afford to do. We couldn't ask them to do, like not do the gold cyanide plant and have to deal with cyanide in the tailings pond because of the economics of the gold recovery. So there was a lot of physical things that I could not address, but I now had an avenue and a leverage to cause things to happen on my own. And a lot of that came from being lucky. I could have been obstructed by Terry Roberts. I could have not been helped by the federal government. There were a lot of things that could have happened to me, and I'm sure have happened to other people that weren't as lucky as I was. But it worked out for me. And when I had enough credibility, people knew it wasn't worth their while to lie to me because they paid later, and I made them pay. I made them pay big when they did lie. In fact, I'm reviewing Bell Mine right now because they're in the closure phase. And they also have acid mine drainage. Not as bad as Equity, but they're right on the Babby Lake drainage. They're an island right in the middle of it. And the mine manager didn't want to take me around the site, but Waste Management called him, and the profile on me now is, tell her what she wants to know, tell her everything now, because if she finds out later, you're going to wish you were never born. That works. It works. And one guy told me I was blackmailing him. Okay, I mean that's just the way things work nowadays. If you're gonna take the chance, you're gonna pay the price later for your ethical conduct. And that's basically, it's very personal. It's what it boils down to. It doesn't boil down to company policy or anything. It boils down to individuals at the table. So, in 1990, I am sitting there with a mountain, 85 million tons of waste material, 25 million tons of tailings, which are the sand from the mill, which are also capable of generating acid. We have a worst case scenario that says if the discharges from Equity are allowed to come down the watershed, everything's dead through the whole Bulkley system all the way to Hazelton, 5 months out of the year. We have bioassay tests that say if you dilute the acid mine drainage that's coming out of the Equity site now, it's sort of like blood because it's so full of heavy metals, that if you dilute it 1 to 10,000, fish still die in a 96-hour LC50. Yeah. And if you do Daphnia tests on the discharge that the company is discharging in 21 days, you do see changes in deformity in the Daphnia. But we're discharging, these are the bottom, this is the best they can do. It's not clean water, but it's the best they can do. So I'm sitting there knowing now, after 9 years, they can't fix what they've done. Knowing now, after collecting data from Australia, from South America, from all the places all over the world, there is no successfully reclaimed acid mine drainage site. Nowhere. And the company is saying this is going to be abandoned, that this is a maintenance-free site and it will not require collection and treatment. Yeah. So the government hired a bunch of consultants and they paid our money to pay them off, and one of them cost $50,000. But these guys said, you're going to have treatment and collection here forever, basically. And at that point in time, the Ministry of Environment's procedures or protocols were taken over by the Ministry of Mines, and the Ministry of Mines proceeded then to do their own worst-case assessment on the equity site. And in the beginning, I was always worried, there's a kiss-off of Buck Creek. They don't care about me, they don't care about the other 37 families. But after the immensity of the site and the impact of the site dawned on me, I felt really good because it was everybody. It wasn't going to be just me. It was going to be people in Smithers, people in Telco get their water directly out of the Bulkley River. It was going to be an entire $30 million a year fishery that was going to be at stake. So I felt a lot more secure that I wasn't going to be poisoned in the name of the economics of the government or the company. And in 1990 and 91, in private consultations where there were no minutes taken, they all agreed to rewrite the Mines Act so that they could collect money from equity to maintain this site forever. And that's basically what we're doing. We're in the process of closure right now, decommissioning the site. There's still an underground component that they're mining out, but the rest of the site is being abandoned right now. And we have a $32 million bond, a security bond. And the interest from that bond is only for maintenance of the site. It can't be used, the money can't be used for anything else, including a permanent solution. Like if we ever find that we have some engineering capability to make a permanent solution of physical mitigation for acid mine drainage, the $32 million will cover that. There won't be enough money. We also had Jim Fulton's office do a legal analysis of this site for us because we knew equity would be gone. Like equity doesn't own anything else except now probably a closet and a phone in Vancouver someplace, because I lost my 4th incarnation of mine managers. I've had 4 at equity. The last one left last week, which means all I have now is the front office and a little 26-year-old environmental coordinator at the site, and 3 other men that are going to be there forever. This site's capable of producing acid mine drainage at the levels it's now generating for 150,000 years. So the bond becomes extremely important, and the interest that this bond can generate becomes extremely important. And that's basically most of what I'm dealing with at this point in time, to make sure that there's accountability, to make sure there's a company. Jim Fulton's office and the lawyer that they hired did a legal accountability study of the different scenarios about what would happen at equity. And I found out that shareholders under Canadian law are not accountable for the companies they hold shares in. And all of the mining companies, except the older, the 60s and 70s mines, which were wholly owned subsidiaries of the major transnationals, all of the mining companies that were instituted after 1980, the major company like Placer Dome only holds shares in equity, even if they're the major shareholder, and they are not accountable under the law. So all of the money that we had to get had to come from equity. And we couldn't even get a letter of comfort or a promissory note from Placer Dome that they would ever be responsible if in fact we wind up not having enough money. So the danger is that someday the taxpayers in this province may well be paying for this site. And it isn't the only site in the province. There's 6 other sites that are abandoned, that the corporate structure that founded them is gone. And we're paying Mount Washington, Britannia, Antiochs, Duthie Mine, we're paying to try to do some reclamation. You can't stop acid mine drainage, but you can You can do some plastic covers and some small things if the site is small to begin with. At Equity this year, it always works out. I'm really good at worst case scenarios now. I'm really good at designing worst case scenario. This year it snowed. We didn't have any snow to speak of, but it did snow a bit. And then June and July, it rained all month. So we had one of the worst summers on record as far as the Equity site goes. And in June of this year, they expended 50,000 tons of lime just to neutralize the acid mine drainage. So where some of us had been insisting for years that weather was one of those variables you couldn't put into a computer model to predict how much this site was going to generate in acid mine drainage, now everyone is much more accepting of the idea that we may not have a handle on worst case scenario at this site. And the other contingent or the other component in the variability system is the groundwater. Because right now we are allowing the site to go back to historical groundwater levels, and that means one pit is full of waste and water already, but the other pit, the main zone pit, is filling up. When we allowed Equity to go to the flooded pit scenario, which means we're losing an option here. Now we can't throw a bunch of waste material into that later. They told us it would be 50 years before that pit would be full of water. And the little environmental coordinator, I had a meeting 2 weeks ago, I asked him, because it's just a computer model on weather, precipitation, evapotranspiration, all the rest of it, groundwater inflows from the pit walls. I asked him how many years it was going to be now. It's going to be 12 years. And then we have another 400,000 cubic meters of water coming down my side. So our annual budget is running between $1.3 and $1.8 million a year, just to not to fix anything, just to maintain the site the way it was. And everybody thinks that I beat them, that I won. Everybody thinks that I should be happy about this, that this is okay. And in fact, John Arrington, he's the head of the reclamation branch, he had a press release a month ago saying that the mines branch's position on acid mine drainage sites, of which SK Creek is going to be another one, that their position is if there's an adequate security bond, that the company should be allowed to go ahead. Yeah. So not business as usual, but business as business. If you just give us a little bit of an insurance policy, and the residents of British Columbia, you just take your chances. And every time we have snow and rain is the worst event we can have at the Equity site. Every time we have a weather event, or every time we have warm spring days, I don't think there's a day that goes by that I don't think about Equity, because I live right on the drainage, right directly below Equity. What happens at Equity is at my house 8 hours later. So the number of spills, I can't even, probably 32 spills they've had. They've been in court twice, once charged by the feds in 1982, went to court in 1983, pled not guilty, walked into court, pled guilty, and were fined $16,000. And then in 1990, pled not guilty, walked into court, pled guilty, and paid $40,000. And basically they broke the law for 6 years to get into court twice. So I really don't, like, this is an evolving thing for me. I really don't even know what the process is going to be like in another year, because then I'm going to be dealing with the 4 men that are permanently on site, taking care of the treatment facility, doing the environmental monitoring, fixing the cats, and cleaning the ditches out. I don't know how that's going to work. And I don't know where the accountability is going to be then. I think I'm going to have to turn more to the government to make them do whatever it is that we need to do at the site.
Who did the environmental consulting for it?
A myriad. B Consultants did their first impact studies in '76 and '77 when it was Sam Goosly Properties, and they both said that there would be acid mine drainage. When they started doing their work, they hire Clone Leonoff for their geotechnical work. They send out all of their monitoring water quality data to ASL Labs. They hire NORCAL. They hire Dave Buster to do fishery studies. But they pretty well have gone through Kerr Priestman. They've gone through just about everybody. It depends on what they need.
Who did the studies for the government that said that was going to be a problem?
The original studies were done by Mike Jones and Bob Hallam, And Bob Hallam is now part of Norcol. He's a consultant. And when he did work for the feds, he did good work. And now all of the stuff that he's done for equity is basically what the company wanted him to do, and most of it is garbage. And I actually have a huge problem with a lot of the consultant work that's been done. But even UBC was hired because we had to have an economic study done on the bond. We didn't know how much we needed to generate the income that would be required.
Well, you know what you're talking about. That's going to work for in perpetuity. I mean, for thousands of, hundreds of years. So how could they even give you any parameters on what you would need? How could you foresee?
It was all a guess. What they did do, that was one of the things, I was included out of that because I guess there's no public record, there were no minutes taken for an 18-month period. The Waste Management Branch in the Ministry of Environment, the Planning Branch in the Ministry of Environment in Victoria, the Reclamation Branch with the Mines Branch, and I think even the Chief Inspector of Mines, Ralph McGinn, they all formed a small subcommittee, and they decided what consultants' reports were needed, and they were about this high, foreclosure, and then they decided sort of the computer model that they would use to decide how bad the site was going to be. And the model they decided upon was that the acid mine drainage would be on an upward curve for a few years, then it would plateau for 1 or 2 years, and then it would start to go down. Well, that's the model. Equity hired a consultant, and I'm trying to SENES, S-E-N-E-S, and they do mathematical models. That was their model. And it's very attractive for a company to say that. But a lot of these sites are capable of having that plateau last for 300 years before you start to see it go down. And we weren't having a stable site. Like, I could accept that computer model maybe in 20 years when our groundwater levels were back to historic levels, but the site is changing. The site is dynamic right now. So I couldn't accept the fact that they had a handle on the top of the curve, you know. It really, yeah, and it still really bothers me because we know there's going to be groundwater flow through the back of the dump from the main zone pit down into the collection system, and that's going to mean more volume. They say, they acknowledge that, but they say there's going to be more volume, but there's also going to be more dilution. And that's the part I don't believe. There's going to be more acid generation. One of the things about the site that's fascinating, this mountain, which is our biggest problem, the waste dump. 1983, I think, we put thermistors, which are giant, long thermometers, in this because this pile is oxidizing. There's bacteria in the pile that are catalyzing the chemical reaction, and basically the reaction goes till the rock is gone. That's what's driving it. It's the physical reality of the rock. So, but this oxidation process is exothermic, which means it creates heat. So if you can measure how active a pile is by measuring the heat that it's generating. And when we put these things in, it was 15 degrees Celsius, and we all said, wow, you know, and it was 15 degrees Celsius in the winter, and then the next year it was 20 degrees Celsius. And when we walked out on the dump with our felt packs, we could feel the heat coming through the bottoms of our feet, and you could see steam venting. And then the next year it was 25 degrees Celsius, and that winter the grass grew on the dump the whole winter, and the snow melted off of it. Now that pile is 50 degrees Celsius all the time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So the oxidation process, they don't even think that the bacteria can live in there unless they've mutated themselves into some new form. Thiobacillus can't live at those temperatures. Like the maximum temperatures thiobacillus can live in is 30 degrees Celsius. So whatever's in there now, if there is still bacteria catalyzing this reaction, it's not the bugs that we measured in 1982. But this is a dynamic process. This is a hard thing to put a handle on. But they had to do it because if they didn't take the money from equity, there was going to be no second chance. And I wanted them to take all of their money. They had $60 million, and I figured take it all. And it's a good lesson. It's one of those deterrent lessons for the rest of them, you know. Take it all, and in 300 years we'll give back what we don't spend. But they wouldn't do it.
One of the problems with the deterrent concept, though, is that, you know, they're deterred to South America now, where they're going to be less.
Yeah, but you know, yeah, you're right. You're right.
It's a big.
And this might be. This part of the migration to South America might be because the Socred government, not the NDP, the Socred government rewrote the Mines Act. They need to rewrite the tenure section of the Mines Act, but they rewrote the security section of the Mines Act so they can take money away from companies that consistently violate the law and pollute our watersheds. So if that's what it means, that to have mining here, we have to allow them to break the law, then I say good riddance, because that's a non-renewable resource. It's not going anywhere. We'll get ethical companies that'll be able to come in here and provide us jobs and mine that stuff in 20 years if we have to wait 20 years, you know. But if that's why they left, then I say good riddance. The number one resource in this province in the next century is going to be clean water. Why the hell should we let them destroy a sustainable resource in the name of 12 years worth of jobs? Because that's how long equity stayed. The socioeconomic impact, and I can't remember who did theirs. Anyway, the socioeconomic impact for equity that was done in 1979 said they were going to be a 20 to 30-year mine, that they were going to work 5-day work weeks, that their milling capacity was 7,500 a day, and when they went in, they worked 7-day work weeks, 12-hour shifts. They never stopped the plant, and this is what mining companies do. It's economical. They upped their milling capacity to 10,000 tons a day, and that 20 to 30-year mine became a 12-year wonder. In and out.
What happened with the other communities as they realized that closure was coming close? Did they come on board with you? Or?
The Houston Council, because we had an alderman at our meetings for 12 years, except it wasn't the same one, of course. That's the hardest thing, is continuity of people and shared memory. Because even the bureaucracy, people are coming and going, and it takes you a year just to get them online sometimes. But the municipality did write a letter about the security bond when they became convinced that all of their wells are on Buck Creek down in town. So if my water's poisoned, their water's poisoned. So they wrote a letter asking the government to be sure that they took enough money in the security bond to guarantee that the site wasn't going to poison Buck Creek.
Was that the extent of their interest?
Yeah. In fact, a lot of people, it's complicated. A lot of people have come up to me in the last year. Number one said, I hope you're satisfied you chased the company away. Not realize, I had a man screaming at me at a public meeting that I had closed Equity Silver Mine. And he waited for me in the parking lot afterwards also. Because they didn't realize they've exhausted their ore deposit. They're done. They're gone. But also they didn't realize that when Equity closed shop that there would still be a problem. They thought somehow that it was the mill or the mining process itself that was creating the environmental problem. A lot of them just don't get it, and maybe they don't want to be bothered, you know. People are busy. So they don't understand that the stuff that was going to cause the problem, that's all the stuff Equity left. Everything else they've taken away with them, you know. It's hard for people to wrap their heads around that, because when you go there, it's not like forestry. If you go into a clear cut, a 400-hectare clear cut, it's pretty obvious what bothers you about it. You go up to a mining site, and especially when Equity ran a good show. Equity, even their boneyard where all their waste went and everything, all the tires were in a line. They're a good mining company. They know what they're doing. They made a lot of money. Their buildings were always painted, you know what I mean? You go up there, what's wrong with that site is almost invisible. You actually have to go and crawl around and go down the hill and into the ditches to actually see what's wrong with that site. So a lot of people have been up to that mine and never even, they don't take them to show them the acid mine drainage. They take them into the mill to see the flotation process. So a lot of people don't even think there's anything wrong.
What about DFO?
DFO, Terry Turnbull came to our meetings for 3 years, and they're conservation officers, basically. They're not involved. Even their habitat biologists. The closest habitat biologist to us was Prince Rupert. There isn't even one in Smithers. And he was in and out. He never got a handle on what was going on. Environment Canada has more manpower, and they have chemical and geotechnical engineers. So they've always been with us all the way along. But when it came to conflict, Fred Claggett had to take Equity to court in '82 because Equity wasn't about to build a proper collection system. It cost them $5 million. So they built a bunch of ditches, and when they overflowed, well, it came down our side and it didn't hurt anything, so what? Yeah, Fred took him into court, and Mackie O, that's his office, took him into court. But since that time, when there's been a choice, like we had some choices that we could have made to make the site maybe more safe, but they were costly choices and they were never made. When it became the feds advocating and the provincial government saying, no, we'll let them do this, the provincial government always wins. the federal government at a table like that doesn't have any power except to advise, to cover off the contingencies and remind them of some engineering problems or something, you know.
So the plan right now is to just maintain the status quo?
That's an interesting, actually, status quo. The last equity meeting we had, of course, we don't have status quo. Because it's weather pattern, even
right.
weather pattern.
Yeah.
We think we have a handle, but groundwater's coming up. But we know that that was another thing. We had no biological assessment for baseline, for trap tissue, for sediment, for anything until we had a problem. So then we couldn't very well go back into the receiving environment and start testing everything. It was already contaminated. But we did, with Environment Canada, there's this George Dirksen, and he just does computer stuff. In '86, he went back to the '83 data and fish tissue, zinc levels, and all the rest of it, sediments, and he compared it to 1986, '87. And what he found was the system was cleaning itself out from those first 2 bad years when all of the acid mine drainage came down in the spring. So we showed impact from the mine in '83, and from then on, even the fish tissues getting less zinc levels, concentrated, no cadmium in their livers. Where '83, '84, we had cadmium in their livers, and a lot of, I'm trying to think of what it is. It's the fatty tissue response to heavy metals in the liver. It's thio something or other. Anyway, we had a lot of that chemical showing up in a lot of our fish because they were being stressed by sublethal effect of heavy metals, but they weren't dying from it. And anyway, he showed a retrieval, let's say, of natural processes from the impact, the original impact of '82, '83. So we think we know now that the discharges, which are about 1,200,000 cubic meters of treated water every year, that we're not impacting anything directly, except that we see zinc levels going up in some of our resident fish populations, like smallmouth dace and little grubs and things like that. So we don't know what 30 years is going to mean, but we think we have status quo as far as safety goes, and that would be a loading. It would be that 1,200,000 cubic meters at certain metals concentrations. So now that we're having to treat, as the groundwater goes up, we have to treat the southern tail pit now to maintain that loading. We don't want to go above that loading and take the risk that we're going to start seeing, because heavy metals are persistent contaminants. It's not even like cyanide. Cyanide eventually breaks down. Heavy metals, when they go into the receiving aquatic environment, they just compartmentalize. They go into the sediment, and the worms in the sediment take them up, and then the fish eat the worms, and then the fish die, and instead of being over here in the sediment, they're over there in the sediment. You know, they don't go away. I always had the idea that the water just flushed them away. But in fact, because we have Goosly Lake there, the metals just are in the bottom of that lake and coming up and down as far as which food chain they're in at the moment. So long term, I really, and I don't think anybody has any idea what we're going to be facing, but we're going to try to maintain the loading, the metals loading that we have right now. And that means equity is going to have to treat a lot more water
When
in the
you
future.
talk about treating it though, what additional to lime, what are you doing? Because lime wouldn't treat heavy metals, right?
Oh yeah, they do. They don't do a wonderful job, but they have state of the art. I think it cost them $21 million for this water treatment plant, and it has 3 cells in it now, and the cells are. No, they're another 10,000 gallon tank with a big mixmaster thing inside of it, and the lime is injected into that. And we have to, right now, our lime consumption, if you have that glass has acid mine drainage in it, you have to have more than half of that filled with lime and agitate it for half an hour to precipitate out the heavy metals. And we have to take the pH up to about 14 because we have a lot of zinc, and they have to be really careful. They have to use enough lime while the iron is still there in our solution. We have a lot of iron. And the iron and the lime co-precipitate out the zinc. If we don't knock the zinc down the first time, we can't get it out anymore. And then we usually have to accept a discharge of high zinc levels because it needs the iron in the solution.
One of the things I looked at last year was, it's a new idea, and I think there's a place on Vancouver Island using it, and I don't know really the geography of the area very well, but they're looking at wetlands, artificial wetlands, as a a means of precipitating metals
Yeah,
using different plants.
yeah.
And
Bell miners too.
bell miners, that's right, they were doing an experiment with it.
Yeah.
So it's not an alternative for your situation.
Well, equity is at about 4,200 feet.
Oh,
So cattails won't even grow there. Summer's too short. And then you have to realize too, wetland systems, I've seen great, we looked into wetland systems, believe me. There's great plans and they handle city sewage quite well, even metals contaminated city sewage. But in our situation, the metals loading would be so huge to the system, I think the vegetation would be killed instantly. At Bell Mine, when I was on the tour, the guy said, do you want to go see our black spruce? Well, where I come from, black spruce is, it's automatically in an environmentally sensitive area. It's set aside, like nobody's allowed to mess with it, and it's precious. So I thought, oh God, you guys saved some black spruce on the site, like you mined around it? And he goes, yeah, it's over by the A-frame dump. Well, the A-frame dump is generating acid, and this whole drainage all the way down to the bay was dead. 17 years worth of acid mine drainage coming out of the A-frame dump. It just killed everything, and the peat in the bottom of this bog that this stuff went through, the copper levels are 15,000 parts per million in the, so forget it. Just forget it. Yeah, they did their wetland systems things, and now the problem that all of us have is that no one wants to have to do this forever.
no,
So the wetland system seems attractive, but you still have to harvest those systems and
Right.
landfill that vegetation because it's contaminated. So not an option,
no.
not now anyway.
I'd like to ask a different kind of question.
Sure.
I'm really struck as you're talking about the amount of scientific and technical knowledge that you have. And I wondered if you started with a background in science or whether you had to learn this as you went along. And
Yeah.
let's start with that question.
Okay. I was in high school, late 50s, early 60s in Point Loma in San Diego, and I didn't know it at the time, but I got an extraordinary education. We took chemistry and physics, and that's my basis. But then when I went to university, I was also an English major. But in those days, you couldn't just be an English major or business major. You had to take a lab science. You had to take all these other things. You had to be a whole person. It just wasn't the idea that you were going to fill a slot in some association or something. So that was all I had. But a lot of the information, a lot of the technical information that's available from the waste management branch, even from the mines, a lot of it is made in two versions. Like there'll be a whole bunch of tables, like Sinis does a computer model of the pit wall or the main zone pit. They'll have a whole bunch of technical stuff, and I won't be able to even read that. But they have to write it so bureaucrats can understand it. So they're writing it like to an 8th grade level. I mean, they have to translate this down so somebody down here that's sitting in an office that has no background at all can read it and make a decision. So that facilitated my learning everything I needed to know.
I guess the reason I'm asking that is because I think, my guess is that a lot of this having to deal with all the scientific and technical information really silences a lot of people. It really intimidates people. And so, I mean, how do we move beyond that? How can we, have you experienced that at all, or do you know of other people?
Oh, it's a technique. It's a technique. They all, in fact, it's fascinating to me. One of the things I wanted to tell you about is I'm not the only woman. Pam's sister Kathy is also a detail person, and Judy Stratton and Francois Lake is also a detail person. If you're not a detail person, what you get when you go into a meeting, you're trapped. Because you can sit there and be righteous all you want. If you don't know anything, they're going to destroy you. They're going to just use your time, waste your time, go do what they want. So you have to learn all that scientific stuff. It's just part of what we do. And if you don't do that, then you're not going to grow as a person. You're not going to know what they're talking about. And I've been at forestry meetings. In fact, we're doing the Antiaco caribou herd, Judy and I, the Tweedsmuir herd that doesn't have enough sense to stay in the park, that goes to a wintering ground south of Vanderhoof, where they're vulnerable to logging and roads and all the rest of it. I was at a meeting, a public meeting, where there were lodge owners and fishermen and everything else, but they didn't like what we were doing because a coalition was starting to form. Like we all of a sudden looked at the native group and we all of a sudden looked at the lodge owners and we realized we all wanted the same thing. The odd man out was these 8 timber industry guys that wanted to log it all. And all the rest of us at the table agreed. So they had us into a meeting, and they just took the level of discussion up one notch. Instead of just talking generalities and values, they started talking timber and growth increments and productivity of the land base and lichen moss sites and lichen sites and dry lichen sites, and everybody from the public just kind of sat back, and except me and Judy, because we did our homework. But it's a technique. Everybody does that to you. Everybody. But if it doesn't work, then you get back to business. Then you get back to real stuff. You get back to what you're talking about, you know. But you have to learn it all. You have to.
I think there's also a danger, though, in getting caught up in that talk and not getting back to fundamental questions that we were trying to ask.
I think that sometimes they waste a lot of my time. They divert me, you know. So you have to go away from especially after like an all-day meeting. You have to go away from the table and think about what happened and get refocused, so that you don't let them divert you or waste a lot of your passion and energy arguing with them about things. But I have found most of them, of course, most of the people that I'm dealing with never realized they were going to have to be dealing with me to begin with. Like, I've been talking to forestry kids, like 25 years old, doing rehab in Swiss fire burn by my house, and he's sitting across the table from me, and I can just see it on his face. Like, no one ever told me when I was in university that I was ever going to have to be talking to her. You know? Like, he should have taken a lot more psychology classes, you know? And he's regretting it. He's regretting it, that he can't cope, he can't deal with it. But I have to deal with these people all the time. I'm good at it. So they're the ones that are vulnerable to my expertise in that field, and it's okay if they divert me, because sometimes even in that confrontation, or even if they try to obstruct me, I learn a lot about the techniques that they use, and then I can recognize it the next time I encounter it. So it's always helpful. Every experience is helpful. Yeah.
So if you think a bond is inadequate, what kind of plan should the government include as part of the mining process for closure at the end, you know, before the mining project starts? How would we address, because you can't have a mine without acid mine rock.
No, you can. You can have, there's quite a few mines that don't have any sulfide in their deposit. There's quite a few of them. We just have a bad geological trick has been played on us in British Columbia, where a lot of our deposits are volcanic in origin. And so we have a lot more sulfide deposits. Same with California and Colorado.
I think, as I understand it, though, acid mine drainage is a problem all across Canada.
Yeah.
All across.
But not at every mine.
Maritimes.
Not at every mine.
No.
Yeah.
But a lot of the mines, you have some type of
That's right.
drainage, even from natural processes.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering what else we could do if a bond might work out to be inadequate over the long term, and you want to still allow mining.
I think that's what the NDP is wrestling with right now. I evaluated the mine plan for Wendy Craig for Tatchinshini Wild. That was a disaster from beginning to end. Getty's, and in fact, the Northern Miner had an article in it that Getty's never approached that process in good faith, that they never really submitted a viable mine plan. The Socreds would not have allowed Getty's to go ahead with Wendy Craig. It doesn't have, a lot of environmental things don't have anything to do with politics. It has to do with covering off cost to society, really. And the Socreds are the ones that rewrote the Mines Act, because they realized if they didn't, they'd be paying for equity. We'd be paying for equity. And politically, that's suicide. The thing that I see with the NDP is when they went into office, one of the things that was unique was that they were going to make some long-term plans. They were going to look ahead, core, you know, a lot of the things that were going on, whether or not core is well motivated, or whether or not it's going to be disabused by industry or the Ministry of Forest themselves. There was some long-term planning. Now I see the NDP forget about the long-term plans. You can't do long-term planning. We are not long-term creatures, right? So now they're into short-term. Now Ann Edwards is up promoting this SK mine. It's going to have acid mine drainage. They want to mill their ore in Houston at the old equity site, which is a lie. They know they can't do that because we now have contaminated site legislation. Nobody else can go on that site except if they're responsible for what the site's making. So no one in their right mind is going to put a mill up at the equity site. But now we see Ann Edwards desperate just to open a mine, because now she's been nailed. The NDP hates mining. The NDP is trying to destroy the economy of the province, you know. So they're in a bind. And I don't, like even John Arrington's little missive that went out as a press release, I don't even see that as a viable option, because if we're having trouble at the end of a life of a mine, trying to realize the capabilities of the site to generate acid and cost us money, how the hell are you going to estimate before the mine opens what kind of problems you're going to be facing? You'll never be able to cover that off in any adequate way. So it's a pacification program to save themselves the label that they're anti-industry and anti-mining. And it's not going to end. It's not going to end until they're out of office or they're reelected, because now they're running scared. They've been called names, and now they have something to prove. Ann Edwards is allowing a road to be built into a mine that doesn't even have a conditional approval to go ahead. A road to nowhere if this mine is an environmental disaster. So I just see cowardice and desperation, and I think we're all going to pay the price for that in the next 3 years. And the mining industry will be back. I can remember in '83 there were mines. A lot of people went to Papua New Guinea. Placer was one of them. And because I was causing so much trouble, I would hear from the equity mine manager, because of you, we're opening mines in third world countries, and we're going to make a lot of money. They had horrendous problems in Papua New Guinea and other places, logistics problems, keeping good workers at the site, because they were basically armed camps. Even in Mexico, they had trouble keeping people on site. The minute the people can get out of there, they're gone again, you know. So they're going to be back, and hopefully by that time, they'll know the ground rules, and they'll be accepting of the fact they're going to have to do it right. With a massive sulfide deposit, they won't be able to do that.
But do you see it as a viable option? I mean, it sounds like economically mining, I mean, if they're responsible enough to control the environmental damage, I mean, is it an economic option?
No, it's not with a massive sulfide deposit, not now, because there's no technology. So you're going to be looking at another forever problem. We have 5 mines right now. Kimberley Mine, I have a card with a list of them, but there's 5 Myra mines in the middle of Strathcona Park. Westmin's mine, huge acid mine drainage problems. We have 5 mines going to closure right now in this problems, and I'm sure there's lots of secret meetings going on about who's going to pay for them, you know.
It just seems like mining is no longer an option as an industry as a whole, because it just doesn't, unless it's heavily subsidized by the government, it just doesn't seem like an economic option. And that if the province does want to be environmentally responsible, they should look to other things to provide employment.
Yeah, for the short term, I think that's true. But the best thing about it is those deposits aren't going anywhere. You know, those deposits. In fact, I have a huge problem. I mean, when you talk about the sustainable development aspect of mining, who said that in one generation we would mine 160 million years worth of ore bodies in this province, that we have to extract it all now? We have a responsibility probably to future generations to slow down the exploitation of the mineral resources of this province and get a handle on some long-term planning, you know? Because at the rates that we were going, a lot of these deposits, equity is 150 million years old. I mean, we're not going to have another one that we can go into if we want some more silver in 20 years. So I don't see that as a social problem for us. It's just a short-term problem. But the engineering problems that we face, finding a solution for the acid mine drainage problem. In fact, next week they're having a 2-day conference here, and they're just having technical papers delivered on all of the experiments and the work that's being done out in the world at these various sites to try to see if anybody's come up with any good alternatives. And there isn't going to be any news. I mean, it's a difficult problem.
No, I was just, it's almost 22, so I was just going to, go ahead, ask your last question, then we'll wrap it up.
Oh, well, I have several questions, so
Oh,
I'll just
well,
ask.
and we can
We
also
need to
go
sit
for
here and
lunch.
talk.
Well, okay, so I'd like to know, as a woman, what your experiences have been
him.
Oh, sorry, guys.
Look, it's not a woman, it's a mother.
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't know. I have a bad attitude. And men pick up on it right away.
You have a bad attitude, or
Yeah.
men say you have a bad attitude?
No, I have a bad attitude. I was basically, my mother's Scotch, and I was basically raised to be anti-authoritarian, stick up for myself and don't take any shit from anybody. And I don't like being patronized. I don't even like people, if somebody's like this guy from Home State, Prime Resources, SK, my environmental coordinator, he's too nice to me. I know he hates me because he's too nice to me. You know, you can just tell. They overdo it. They just, but I haven't ever had, with government bureaucrats, I've been really, and this is individual too, with government bureaucrats I've been really lucky because the Smithers regional offices have a bunch of really extraordinary men in them. But I'm dealing with all men. I had one geotechnical engineer, Perry Mailing, with Environment Canada, and I'm trying to think now if I ever had any other woman. I have a couple of the women on some of my forestry committees that are in the loop, in the bureaucracies, but everybody else is men, and there's a real difficult, goal-oriented, antagonistic, equal opportunity abuser attitude. If you're at the, I've never had a chairperson save my ass from being verbally abused by anybody, and I have been verbally abused, and I've just learned to deal with it. I mean, you can't, I've almost cried a couple times, but you can't do that. You can't get up and leave the table. You can tell them that that's not acceptable social behavior and try to move through it, you know. But the chairs are men too, and they figure if you're at the table, you take what you get, and if you don't want to take it, then you leave the table, you know. So it's difficult, but it's I don't even know how to explain it, but it's all personal. It's not that I hold anything against the company for this man's behavior. He's accountable if he's laying trips on me. You know what I mean? But I've actually had people that were arguing with me. The mine manager, Doug Fraser at Equity, he actually was. We argued, and then he got up and walked around the table and put his hand on my shoulder to make a point. Stood over me to make a point. You know. And I've had a lot of men do the physical, hands behind the back bullshit and the leaning forward, but the latest manager, and things are changing. The difference in the last 5 years, they've all been to sensitivity workshops and stuff. They know now what acceptable, it's like the men don't know where the line is, they know where the line is. If they do it, it's a strategy. And then you can identify that right away, because most of them are really good at working with women. Most of them have women in their staffs, most of them reasonably well sensitized to the issues and stuff. But the latest manager at Equity Silver Mines, Brian Robertson, he is a Zen master. In 3.5 years, I haven't been able to get in one argument with him. Not one. And when at the last meeting, he said it was his last meeting and he was leaving, and I told him, 3.5 years and I haven't even been in an argument with you. You know, he's got the technique water over the rocks. You know, I've asked him the same question 5 times and he's refused to answer that question. You know. He's just a classic example, but perfect gentleman. Perfect gentleman. I'd almost rather get in a fight with somebody, you know? It's just, sometimes it's really frustrating. And the same with the forestry. Some of the forestry people are that way too. Like they've gotten the technique down, and it isn't, nobody's macho anymore. I guess the worst examples of that, I guess, would have to be the forest industry personnel, Northwood and HFP. But even they're learning. It used to be they'd go to workshops and learn combat techniques, but now they go to workshops and learn consensus and process. So things are changing. I have no idea what they're doing. They go home, you know, maybe they go into the garage and scream for half an hour. Not my problem.
You don't have any backers, eh? Big backers.
Actually, I don't. I pay for everything I do. This is the first time I've spoken at a lot of things, and other speakers have been paid, but they never pay members of the public to speak. This is the first time that I've been paid my expenses to go someplace and speak somewhere. I always have to pay my own way, but on the other hand, my husband works at Northwood. He drives the train out in the yard to take the loads out to CN. That deflects a lot of criticism that I don't care about jobs. No one pays me, and I'm not on staff with anyone. In some ways, then, someone can say, well, you just represent yourself. but I have enough credibility now and enough of a portfolio that evaporates into the air. But if I'm not being paid by Sierra Club, if I'm not receiving any money from anyone, they can't attack me for having an agenda or being, you know what I mean? I'm just there, I'm just me. And it saved me, I think, a lot of grief that I've done all this on my own.
I don't even recall that side channel at all.
What happened is, this was all connected right here,
Yeah.
and on the other side is where the creek, that estuary
flood came.
overflowed into here. And then I actually went down there and got gravel in here, but this was all one piece here.
Yeah. I know.
And the creek used to go left through that thing in there.
And now there's this big hill of water, meadow.
Talk about gravel.
Wow.
Talk about change. Yeah, I used to be able to drive down through here, all the way through there and down below and get some gravel. And then this thin piece was here for a long time and then it washed out. It's amazing how low the creek's gone though. How much it's eaten.
Actually, we're lucky. We have the fish are lucky. We have as much water in there as we do.